just the lecture material here. There's some, I would say, standard topics that are part of an ecology class, and we would be remiss not to talk about them. And a lot of these things I've really saved for our time that we're kind of live, to make sure that I emphasize them a bit more, and if you want to ask questions about them. A lot of material, which is also pretty standard for an ecology course, I have uploaded as short web videos, and that stuff's up there. It's part of the class, and a lot of it I expect is more on the review side, and I will reference it from time to time here. But so what we're talking about in this part of the class really comes down to how natural communities change, both how they change by factors that are outside of our control, as well as factors that are in our control. This helps us understand how the resources are changing, how sustainable they may be, and what we can do about it. So management is about manipulating forests, and ideally in some way that helps us sustain the resources we're dependent on. So a couple questions I want to go over here as we're wrapping up the class. How do forest ecosystems develop and form? And that's just asking what are their dynamics, natural dynamics, without the impact of people? What maintains the values that we look for in forests? So what structure or composition creates fire-safe communities, or maintains timber production, or provisions water, all the things that we're interested in forests we need forests to provide. And then probably one of the most important things that I want to emphasize, and I really am going to strive to make sure that this goes throughout the rest of the topics, is that change is constant in forests. One of the problems with them is that forests grow, develop, and change over the course of our lifetimes. And their development may take more than a single one of our lifetimes. Forget about like our career, our working career. It's actually like, trees that my grandfather would have planted may now be at the stage where they could be harvested or would need to be maintained in some way. It's a multi-generational problem. And what that means is that you go out and you look at it, and it's changing, but it's changing slowly. But if you don't approach it as a dynamic thing, then you're gonna make some mistakes. At least that's what's happened in the past. So, management, and this is where kind of both these things come together. Management relies on forest response to disturbance. So lots of times maintaining the things that we care about is wrapped up in the biological characteristics of the system and how they respond to something like tree mortality or tree removal and so forth. So I can't remember if I've shown this picture before, but back here you see these trees, they have numbers on them, and there's some that are really red and some that are darker. This is Quercus suber, this cork oak in the Algarve region of, this is actually in Portugal, but this is an example of non-timber forest resources. Cork, this is the source of natural cork. The highest quality cork you can get for wine, for wine barrels, so forth. And it's not an accident. These forests are extensive, but they have to be maintained in very specific ways in order to produce this resource. And it's an important resource. This is not a particularly well-off part of the world. Cork, it grows on trees, and individual trees might net you like €100 a year or so, which is a lot. Maybe it was less than €100. How much? I can't remember. But they're basically, you have trees on your property, and they're essentially making you money just by being there. And the other thing that's great about it is you can harvest cork about once every 8 years. And you're actually seeing that here. There, you can see this 2 in the background on this really red tree that had just been harvested in 2012, I think. And this one has a 6 on it, had been harvested in 2006. So, you know, they're right on there to kind of give a sense of when they can go back and reharvest it again. Anyway, everything about this stand, how open it is, the spacing of the trees, how the cork is removed, all of that is intentional in order to maintain the production of cork, not an accident. So I'm going to get right into one of the things that I think is kind of the most important part of this chapter that we read. And that's kind of relating this idea of change to the structure of forests as we see them. Forests are in constant state of change, but they look different across the history of their development. And in particular, what we do to manage them has a tremendous influence on what is present in that forest, and both in terms of who is there and how they are distributed. So for example, you know, this first example is pretty simple, something that would be typical of, say, a plantation, where we have a very narrow range of diameters. And in fact, where we have diameters that are, you know, all the trees are more or less one size. For us, the best example of this locally would be something like the eucalyptus stand in Montana de Oro. There's actually very little regeneration there. Most of the trees are all about the same size. And that's because they were managed that way. That's intentional. I used to work at a research forest that had lots of red pine plantations, this eastern species red pine. And they all the stands look like this. All the trees are about the same size, about the same shape. This is very intentional. It is a very efficient way to grow timber. So I'm not saying that it is always bad. It's not. If you're trying to grow timber and you're trying to grow it straight and you need all the trees about the same size for your goals, this is really great practice. Now, the problem with this is there's no regeneration in this stand. There is no diversity of size classes, and there's no diversity of species. So, you know, contrast that with something where, which is really probably more typical for natural stands. That's where you have a distribution of species. Generally, in a stand that isn't being manipulated so strongly, you will have more small trees than large trees. When we look at our data set, we're going to find most stands that there are more small stems than large stems. That's pretty typical. This is the reverse J distribution. And that diversity helps maintain forests, because we can, if we're trying to harvest timber, we can take trees out of the overstory, and there's already regeneration there present that can take that space over in the canopy. And you know, it can be this kind of example can become more complicated. You know, kind of end up with things like this, where it's you know, kind of looks like a kind of jumbled mess, and even more so, we can start to add species diversity as well. So yeah, and that's kind of one of the take-home points of this, is that complexity and diversity is both who's there as well as how they are shaped, their ages and sizes, and that's something that's actually fairly specific to forests ecosystems. If we were working in grasslands and lots of shrublands, the issues of size are just not as important. Annual grass communities, you know, that all the individuals die every year, so they don't have diversity in terms of sizes of individual trees, not individual plants, not like we do in forests. There's some interesting things. There's no set size class distribution for wildland stands because the distribution of tree sizes and tree species is it's actually a record of everything that has happened in these stands. And it's one that can be hard to read. It can be quite hard to understand why certain species are present in stands at the abundance or in the distribution that they are. It's a record of everything that has happened there, everything in an evolutionary sense, everything in a management sense, everything in some sort of natural disturbance sense. So, you know, wind, pathogens, insects, and fire. And oftentimes, we are trying to understand how things got to look the way they did because we're trying to get to something practical, which is how do we maintain the resources that we care about. So this other graph here is just pointing out that even age stands have a low range of variability even when they are old, and that's this even age stand distribution that I'm kind of showing here. Here's an example where you have 3 age classes, or if this was 3 different stands, you'd have 3 different general age distributions in each of them. In each one of these cases, there's not very much diversity. In a situation where the overstory is highly susceptible to some sort of damage, like wind or insect outbreak or pathogen outbreak, having this kind of even age size distribution can be problematic, even when those trees are old. I'm going to show you some examples of that. Okay, but before we do that, so that's real forests. But let me just back up a little bit and talk about the beginnings. And this is something that's pretty typical in like a high school biology class when you cover succession. I'm going to just start with the simplest thing here, which is the these really dramatic events. I want to point out, disturbance in forests can be, these are events, change structure and composition, and they can come in 2 different forms, or at least 2 different forms. They can be very discrete in time, something that you can point at, a fire, some event. In this case, this is development. This is near Hanoi, and this area has been all cleared for development. It will actually end up being reforested or revegetated, but initially the development here was to remove everything. These events can be chronic or in time as well, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But so discrete events we talk about, and really kind of what I want to talk about here is what's called primary succession, which means that there is a clean slate. So just like this, we have a clean slate. In this case, they're scraping down off all the topsoil, removing all the vegetation. They're going to start over. That happens in many natural systems as well. It happens with glaciers. So here's an example of glaciated terrain. These valleys were filled with glaciers during the last ice age. That's how you get these mountain forms, these steep lower slopes and rocky peak tops. In fact, there's a glacier right up here, the Crow Glacier. This is in New Zealand. This is the Crow River here. And then the other place where there is, that's primary, an event that scoured out the soil and started primary succession in tens of thousands of years ago. But more recently, there's constant renewal in this landscape because these are big rivers, and they flood every year. In fact, when I was here, I was trying to cross these things and I couldn't because I would have died, and I was trying not to die. Go figure. That's job number 1 when you're in the mountains. Yeah, so these things flood. They scour out all of these sediments, and succession is started over, renewed constantly. It's not an accident that that these alluvial plains are unforested. If they were not flooded, they would be forested. There's no reason for trees not to be there. The only reason they're not there is because they're constantly being renewed. But here's another way that we get primary succession in forests. That sort of flooding happens in many of our ecosystems. There are riparian ecosystems, a lot of our redwood ecosystems. But in a lot of the world, basically from you know, in the Cascades and other parts of the world, this is Popocatépetl in Mexico, and you know, big volcanic explosions can just reset succession in landscapes. This is it's a big mountain, it's a big volcano, it's active, it erupts fairly regularly, and if it had a big eruption, it would scour out all this forested land that you see below here. But the you know, case study number one of volcanoes creating primary succession is Mount St. Helens. Erupted in the 80s, and you know, massive earthquake, and then a collapse of the mountain. The eruption was expected, but it was unclear when it would happen. And like I said, there was this big earthquake, and half the mountain, you know, fell off, and the other half blew up. And this is a relief map of what this did. It scoured out all these forests, very productive forests. Some of the most productive forest lands in the country were just completely scoured out, completely buried, and essentially all reset. And this was, you know, a combination of pyroclastic flows and then landslides. And the ash, the pyroclastic flows are molten rock. You know, they don't look like lava, but they are burning rock. It just looks like smoke or ash or whatever. And so, you know, it just burns all the vegetation and then buries it. And then really more or less destroys all or most of the soil microbes and everything. So it's a total restart. This eruption scoured off the mountain and then knocked down timber in all the surrounding lands, and there's lots of timber, large tracts of timber company owned land up here, and it was very damaging. Like I say, it's some of the most productive forest lands in the country, and actually they did recover quickly. Weyerhaeuser did a great job being smart about reintroducing soil microbes, doing lots of planning, and rehabilitating sites, and they actually were able to recover a lot of their timber resources, or at least they're on the right path. You know, it's only been 40 years. And anyway, in the public land, this is just, you know, it's all recovering on its own. And I don't know, I haven't been to Mount St. Helens, but I'd like to. Like I say, those are kind of some examples of really discrete events, but lots of times the disturbances that we're interested in are going to be kind of constant low-level things. Sometimes they might be very pronounced, but you know, you think about management, something like management, oftentimes something that is sort of incremental, fairly regular, maybe, you know, particular in time. So here's a photograph from Chiapas. This is community forestry in Mesoamerica. You can see there's some stumps out here. You can even see how some of the logs are sawed up. These resources are used both for building materials as well as firewood. And what you got here is the structure of this forest is being created and maintained by the actions of people here. And you can start to see some of that in the distribution of tree sizes as well as their spacing. within the stand. So there are a lot of different ways to achieve structure, and both in ways that you intend and ways that you do not. Yeah, and this kind of multiple entries into a stand, kind of use when necessary, is one way that it can be developed. Now, we've spent a good chunk of class talking about fire, but I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge it once again. These are very discrete events, but they're different than primary succession. I would say that fires, even some of our most destructive fires in California, are rarely primary succession. And the reason for that is because our species are just so well adapted to it. I had, a couple weeks ago, I showed you photographs of all that black oak and Big Sur after the Soberonix fire, where the canopies had all been burnt off, but within a few months, the trees were all refoliating. That was because the individual trees had survived, 90% survival. And those species are adapted to these events. So, was there mortality? Yeah, there was mortality. Did they lose their entire canopy? Yes, they did. But the individual trees also have these adaptations for surviving fire, and they reestablish. So definitely fire is a major disturbance within our forests. It's not always primary succession because many species survive. They're adapted to it. Now, there are examples of systems where fire changes the structure in a more dramatic way. Lots of our shrublands, our chaparral, are the overstory is consumed, and we can have these patterns of renewal. Fire oftentimes creates patterns of renewal, whether it's in shrublands or not. In this case, you've got the overstory is removed, and then that's creating habitat for forbs, the herbaceous stuff. And you may be aware that many plants are so-called fire followers. They're associated with fire. They benefit from occasional disturbances like this because it renews the system. It removes light limitation, mineralizes nutrients in the soils. The systems are very much adapted to this. Cool. Also, a partial disturbance, and one that is much less discrete in time, one that I would say is more chronic, are outbreaks. Our Sierra bark beetle outbreak from the last decade is a great example of this. Sierra bark beetle outbreak killed 300 million trees, more or less. It killed primarily a handful of species. Millions of trees were killed. You can see all the dead trees in this photograph. This is from the Needles, by the way. That part of California we're talking about. But it didn't kill the entire forest. In fact, if you go up there this weekend, it will not look like this. But you can find dead trees. You can find a lot of dead trees up there. But all the foliage has fallen off. A lot of the snags have fallen down. It doesn't look like this. This is in 2016. And the foliage stays on for a few years and then it falls off. So what I want to emphasize about this is this mortality happened over the course of about 5 years. Didn't happen all at once. It didn't happen in every species. The bark beetles do tend to attack larger trees. So in places where the size class distribution made these stands more susceptible to bark beetle mortality, they had more mortality. The Southern Sierra is a really good example. It's productive enough to grow lots of big trees, but it's far from any mills. So most of this material would never have been harvested, would never have been salvaged. There was, as far as I can tell, no active forestry going on in this region, right or wrong, but certainly the landscape was poised for a big outbreak, and then we had it with associated with the drought. And here's sudden oak death. This is the research topic that I spend the most time on. This is also from Big Sur. Again, a tree mortality event, a disturbance event that is ongoing, right? It's this mortality. You can see a lot of mortality in this photograph. That's why I like to show it. But this mortality is happening over the course of, like a decade. Now, of course, all the orange trees have died recently, because even though this is mostly tan oak that's dead here, what happens with sudden oak death is some years are worse for mortality than others. But basically, this is just kind of slowly burning through the stand, slowly killing multiple trees, and doing so over, on timescales of like 5 to 10 years. Most of these trees would have been infected by this the Phytophthora, the sudden oak death pathogen. They would have been infected 2 years before they died. So the pathogen has probably been present in this stand for like a decade. It just takes that long to build up within the stand and then spread within the stand, and then for the trees to die. So anyway, this is it can be kind of shocking to look at this, but this is something that emerged, that took time to emerge. Okay. Adaptation and adaptability. And I like to come back to the idea of adaptation. It's one of the first topics that we cover in this class, evolutionary adaptation. And now, in talking about management, I think it's good to bring it up again, and maybe even expand the definition. So initially, we talk about adaptation in an evolutionary sense. Why do our plants look the way they do? How do their characteristics lead to success in the landscape? Maintenance of their populations. What is it biologically about them that causes them to dominate various forests? But adaptation can also be thought of as a management strategy. And for that matter, we can think about what we can do to help our natural ecosystems, forests and otherwise, help these become better adapted, more resilient to a changing environment, and more resilient to changing economic pressures as well. So, what is the adaptability of stands? Can they retain critical functions or resources, whether it's water or timber? Fire, of course, is this problem which hasn't gone away and won't. We have not solved problems associated with fire. And we also understand that they seem to be getting worse. They seem to be getting bigger and more frequent. Fire is an increasing problem all across the world, but especially in the Western US. And I think we have an opportunity here to ask, what is resiliency in a fire-prone environment? How do we make our forests more resilient, or not just our forests, but our whole linked urban, suburban, and natural ecosystems? How do we deal with this? It's not just fire, of course. Different parts of the world, you could pose a lot of the same questions or problems with other kinds of disturbances. Land use, previous clearing, forestry, agriculture. These things affect the structure of forests and their capacity to maintain resources. Wind, and that is not something that we think about first here in California, but in British Columbia, in Siberia, and in many tropical forests. Issue number one is wind, especially in places that get hit regularly by hurricanes. Wind is a major cause of mortality, and it can totally screw up your management plan. Particularly when you are trying to grow timber or something like that in the South, and then you got a hurricane that comes in and blows it all down. can change your perspective on things. And then insects and diseases, and in general, parts of maritime Canada, much of Europe are primarily structured by insects and diseases more so than fire. But with the introduction of invasive species, we're seeing insects and pathogens affecting more and more different kinds of forests. Okay, here's the last thing that I want to cover here for today. California forests are very diverse. You know, is succession different across different forest types or different woody ecosystem types? The answer to that is both yes and no. The ecosystems are different. They have different frequencies of disturbance. They have different responses to disturbance. But overall, the process has a lot of similarities across it. So here's something that's kind of interesting. I want to show you here. This is a ratio of herbs to shrubs. So you can think about it as herbaceous plants to woody plants. And this is disturbance frequency. And then it's got classes of climate types. So really dry areas, places that are relatively wet, and then things that are in between. We can find examples of this across California. What this is saying is, what this is showing is that at low disturbance frequencies, you tend to have a dominance of woody plants. In wet areas, regardless of the disturbance frequency, you also tend to have dominance of woody plants. Woody plants take longer to grow. They hold their space better. But if you have constant renewal, constant floods, or sometimes fire, so forth, you can actually, even in those cases, shift these systems to non-woody. So this gives us some framework. If we're trying to where we're trying to maintain forests, changes in climate as well as changes in disturbance frequency are going to influence how successful we are. That's the point, right? So now you have a framework for predicting what. Now you have a framework for predicting how resilient the system might be. So, you know, some of the other some of the things we have going for us, you know, tree resprouting, individual survival. It takes a lot, actually, remarkably a lot to kill individual trees in the Coast Range. They are adapted to some pretty powerful disturbances. And just go out to an area that's burned recently and you'll see evidence of that. Seed banks and serotiny are also a great adaptation for survival in our high fire frequency, intense fire environments. And then on top of that, we do have a range of plants that are better adapted to colonize areas that have been recently disturbed. And I showed you a picture of that renewed landscape where all the shrubs have been burned off, versus those that are better competitors, you know, especially like trees. They can hold on to the areas that they establish on, and they're harder to get. They're harder to remove. Cool. So I think that's enough stuff. There's quite a bit of material that's was uploaded to the YouTube channel for this week. I don't think I'm going to upload any other material up there unless I have to. Ideally not, just so that we can kind of, like I say, maintain this time for discussion. On Tuesday, we will go over the data analysis exercise, and and then next week, I'll make sure that I touch base with each group to make sure that you're on the right track with your group projects. We'll have a bit more material to cover some ideas and things, but we can definitely just stretch this out and keep it in this question of resiliency and so forth. Great, I'm gonna stop the recording.